Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The vending machine in Bay 7 had been dispensing the wrong nutrient packs for 11 days, and at this point, Kale Morrow had accepted it as a feature rather than a fault. He fed it a credit chip, received something labeled protein blend citrus adjacent, peeled back the wrapper with the resignation of a man who had stopped expecting the universe to behave, and walked back toward triage eating what tasted primarily like ambition and mild regret. Meridian General did not sleep. This was not a metaphor. The facility ran on a 26-hour cycle, calibrated to serve species whose biological clocks ranged from the Solhari, who required rest every 9 hours or began making catastrophically optimistic decisions, to the Valen, who slept once a week in a state so deep that triage protocol required a secondary confirmation before listing them as conscious. The lighting in the main corridor shifted accordingly, warmer in the cycles approximating biological night, cooler when the station's external sensors registered traffic peaks at the docking ring. Right now it was the blue-white of high-function hours, and the corridor had the particular energy of a place that never fully wound down, but was currently pretending to consider it. Kale had been working emergency medicine at Meridian General for 6 years. He had arrived with the specific optimism of a doctor who believed that multi-species medicine represented the frontier of human medical knowledge, and that working at a junction point facility was a calling rather than a posting. He still believed that. He had simply also learned that the frontier involved a great deal of paperwork, that VERA, the triage AI, communicated exclusively in probability percentages and had the emotional register of a well-maintained spreadsheet, and that the Solhari merchant in Bay 2, who came in every few months with a new plasma-related injury, was either the unluckiest man in 3 systems or conducting some form of long-term personal research he declined to explain. The queue that morning was 12 patients deep before he had finished his first coffee. A Drenathi with a secondary lung issue, irritated and dignified about it in equal measure. A human child who had eaten something described on the intake form only as a dare. 2 Valen workers from the docking ring, with pressure exposure symptoms that VERA had rated at a 4.1, which in VERA's personal numerical language meant manageable but not comfortable. Kale moved through them with the practiced efficiency of someone for whom medicine had long since stopped being a series of individual events and become instead a continuous, living problem he was perpetually in the middle of solving. He was between patients, standing at the intake terminal and reading a new file when the alert changed. VERA's voice did not carry urgency. It was constitutionally incapable of it, but the priority classification did the work that tone could not. The words Priority 1, Trauma, Inbound, appeared in the upper register of his display with the calm certainty of a system that processed catastrophe and comfort with identical indifference. And Kale was already moving before VERA finished routing the case to Bay 4. They came through the main doors in a knot of panic, 4 of them, 2 humanoid and 2 that Kale's peripheral vision registered as Velosian based on the iridescent quality of their skin in the corridor light, all of them speaking simultaneously in what his translation chip rendered as a layered argument between urgency and fear. The stretcher between them held a child. Kale stopped looking at the adults. The child was small, young, perhaps 8 or 9 years in whatever aging scale applied, though Velosian physiology was not his strongest area, and he was already flagging that gap in the back of his mind as a problem he would need to solve in approximately the next 4 minutes. The injuries were significant. The transit pod impact had done the kind of damage that looked chaotic on the surface and was almost certainly worse organized underneath. And VERA, scanning from the bay's overhead sensors, updated her assessment to survival probability. 34% without immediate intervention in the same tone she used to report cafeteria hours. "Thank you, VERA," Kale said, which was something he said reflexively and which VERA had never once acknowledged. He assessed. The Velosian circulatory system ran on a different pressure architecture than most humanoid species. He knew this from a paper he had read 2 years ago, and a case he had handled briefly before a specialist took over, which meant his working knowledge was academic in a situation that required it to be practical. The standard trauma protocol hit its first wall inside 90 seconds. He made a decision, adjusted, made another decision, adjusted again, working through the logic the way he always worked through the logic, not with certainty but with the closest available approximation of it, which was all emergency medicine ever actually offered anyone. The 10 minutes did not feel like 10 minutes. They never did. They felt like a particular quality of compressed time in which the room shrank to the dimensions of what was immediately necessary, and everything outside that boundary ceased to have meaningful existence. His hands knew the work. His mind ran ahead of his hands, calculating, discarding, selecting. At some point, one of the Velosian adults said something his translation chip rendered only partially, and he said without looking up, "I need you to be quiet or I need you to be useful, and right now quiet is more useful," and they were quiet. The monitors shifted. VERA updated her probability assessment. The number was considerably higher than 34%. Kale exhaled once, gave the transfer orders to intensive care, and stood back. The child's hand rested open on the sheet, 4 fingers, slightly curled. A faint luminescent mark pulsing slowly at the base of her throat, steady, and even now where before it had been arrhythmic and faint. He looked at it for exactly as long as it took him to understand that the crisis was resolved and the next one was waiting. He did not ask her name. He had 13 more patients in the queue. He went back to work. The lockdown did not announce itself dramatically. There was no alarm, no cascading red light rolling down the corridors in the manner of the adventure serials Kale had watched as a child. No voice from the ceiling telling everyone to remain calm in the specific tone that guaranteed no one would. What happened instead was subtler and, in its way, more unsettling. The facility simply became more still than it should have been. The way a room becomes still when everyone in it has received the same piece of news and has not yet decided what to do with it. Kale noticed it between patients. He was moving from Bay 6 to the intake terminal when he registered that the usual cross-traffic of the main corridor had thinned, that the 2 orderlies who were normally arguing near the supply station at this hour were not there, that VERA had stopped routing new intake notifications to his queue without explanation or updated priority flags. He stood at the terminal for a moment, reading the silence the way 6 years of emergency medicine had taught him to read silences, which was as a category of information rather than an absence of it. Then the security personnel arrived, and the silence explained itself. There were 8 of them, station security in full facility lockdown configuration, which Kale had seen deployed exactly once before during a contraband biohazard incident 18 months ago that had turned out, after 4 hours of quarantine and 2 levels of decontamination protocol, to be an unlicensed Sulhari fermentation experiment with an unusually aggressive vapor signature. The security team moved with the energy of people who had been told something important and not told quite enough of it, which produced a specific combination of urgency and uncertainty that expressed itself primarily through standing in doorways and making eye contact with everyone who walked past. Kale walked past 3 of them on his way to the pharmaceutical dispensary. The third one stopped him. The exchange that followed was brief, professionally tense, and ended with the confiscation of the protein bar he had retrieved from Bay 7's vending machine on the grounds that the dispensary corridor was a restricted zone under current lockdown parameters. Kale looked at the security officer. He looked at the protein bar. He considered explaining that he had paid for it and that the lockdown had been initiated after the transaction was complete, which he felt established a reasonable prior claim. He decided, after a moment of genuine internal debate, that this was not the argument he wanted to be having while armed personnel were reorganizing the floor plan around him, and surrendered the protein bar with the quiet dignity of a man saving his energy for something worth spending it on. He found out what was happening 40 minutes later in Bay 7, next to the vending machine, which he was regarding with the expression of someone who had begun to feel that the universe was making a specific and personal point. Dr. Yena Osk did not sit down. This was the first indicator that the conversation was going to be significant, because Yena Osk had spent 30 years in institutional medicine, developing the kind of professional composure that expressed itself partly through the deliberate, unhurried use of available seating. She was Drenathi, tall and gray-skinned, with the secondary respiratory structures along her collarbone that marked her species, and the particular quality of stillness that came from a physiology built for patience. When she stood, it meant she did not expect to be here long, or that what she had to say required the register that standing provided. Her expression was the expression. Cale had seen it on administrators, on senior physicians, on the faces of people who were about to say something that would change the shape of someone's day without being at all happy about the fact. She told him about the Velosian Protectorate. She told him about the royal succession structure, which was singular and matrilineal, and treated the heir with a level of security protocol that apparently involved specialists, diplomatic notification chains, and a 17-step intervention procedure that existed precisely for the scenario he had just handled in 10 minutes with clinical improvisation, and a 2-year-old paper on Velosian circulatory pressure architecture. She told him about the kidnapping, which had been staged as an accident, and the intelligence operatives who had brought the child in and could not identify her without exposing the extraction, and the sector-wide alert that had been running for 11 hours before the child came through Meridian General's doors. She told him about the child. Cale listened to all of this with the attentiveness of a man whose brain was performing 2 operations simultaneously: the surface operation of receiving information, and the deeper operation of understanding what the information meant. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He looked at the vending machine. He looked back at her. He said that he would like to retroactively not have saved that child, please, if it was procedurally possible, and that he was asking in a spirit of genuine professional inquiry rather than ethical ambivalence. Yena Osk did not laugh. She did briefly close her eyes, which in Drenathi physiological terms served a similar function. The situation, she explained, with the precision of someone who had spent the last 30 minutes preparing to explain it, was that his treatment of the princess, without royal protocols, without specialist consultation, without any of the diplomatic infrastructure that was supposed to govern contact with the Velosian heir, had created a legal and political circumstance that the hospital's administrative team was currently describing, in internal communications, as unprecedented, and that external parties were describing in terms that ranged from an act of extraordinary medical heroism to a violation of 17 distinct interspecies procedural agreements, depending on which party was doing the describing and what they needed the description to accomplish. The child was alive. This was, across all parties and all interpretations, agreed to be positive. Everything else was contested. VERA's voice came from the bay's overhead speaker, calm and unhurried, to inform them that a Velosian diplomatic vessel had just requested docking clearance at Ring 4, that 2 additional vessels of unregistered configuration were holding position at the facility's outer perimeter, and that she was rating the current institutional disruption index at a 7.3, which she followed, without perceptible transition, with a recommendation for stress leave for all affected personnel. Cale looked up at the speaker. He had a number of things he wanted to say to VERA. He said none of them. He asked Yena Osk if anyone had at least cleared his patient queue, because he still had 9 people waiting and the universe, as best he could tell, had not stopped producing emergencies simply because he was standing in the middle of one. She arrived without announcement, which in the context of the last several hours was either a diplomatic courtesy or a deliberate demonstration that she did not require one. Kale was in the middle of his fourth consecutive administrative interview in a room that had been designed for diplomacy and achieved the specific atmosphere of a place where no one was entirely comfortable and everyone was pretending otherwise. When the door opened and the Velosian delegation rearranged itself in a way that told him, before he had turned around, that whoever had just entered outranked everyone currently in the room. Her name, he would learn from a briefing document rather than from anyone with the basic courtesy to simply introduce her, was Serevith Olenve. She was the High Protector of the Velosian royal household, which his translation chip rendered accurately enough, but which carried a weight of institutional meaning that no translation could fully convey, in the same way that saying someone was in charge of things accurately described a stellar cartographer but missed certain relevant details. She looked human. This was the first thing Kale registered, in the way you register something that is almost familiar and then realize the almost is doing significant structural work. Her skin carried an iridescence that shifted between silver and a deep water blue-green as she moved through the room's light, and her eyes were large and dark and contained a second iris ring, a luminous band sitting just outside the first, pale and mobile, changing color in a way that his peripheral vision kept logging as important information, without being able to specify why. Her hair fell with a particular quality of light that he could not account for by the room's overhead panels. She had 4 fingers on each hand. This last detail kept catching in his attention with the persistence of something his brain had filed under unresolved. He was aware that it was doing this. He found it unhelpful. She looked at him for a moment before she sat, with the assessing quality of someone who had spent considerable time learning to read people quickly and accurately, and was currently forming a conclusion she had not yet chosen to share. Then she sat down and she asked him, not with anger, not with the diplomatic formality he had been preparing for, to explain, in clinical terms, exactly what he had done and why he had made the decisions he made. Kale had been prepared for several versions of this meeting. He had prepared for official gratitude, which he understood would be formal and structured, and would require him to stand in a specific place and respond to things in a specific order. He had prepared for accusation, which the hospital's legal team had briefed him on extensively, and which would involve the 17 procedural violations being itemized in a language designed to make competence sound like negligence. He had not prepared for a technical debrief, because it had not occurred to him that the first question from the High Protector of a galactic royal household would be the same question a residency supervisor might ask after a difficult case, delivered with the same quality of professional attention. So he answered honestly, because that was the only mode he had available when caught off guard. He explained the physiology gap, that his working knowledge of Velosian circulatory architecture was sourced from academic reading, and one prior case that a specialist had taken over before it became genuinely difficult, which meant he was extrapolating from principle rather than practice. He explained the decision points where standard protocol had reached the limits of cross-species applicability, and he had made judgment calls based on available evidence rather than established procedure. He explained, with the specific tired candor of someone who had been in administrative interviews for 3 hours and had not eaten since VERA's vending machine confiscation incident, that he had operated on the premise that the fundamental distress signals of a child in trauma were sufficiently universal across humanoid species to serve as a working baseline, and that this premise had held. Serevith Olenve listened to all of this without interrupting. The second iris ring, which had been a deep and unsettling violet for the first part of the meeting, shifted during this explanation towards something warmer that his brain, mapping it against available emotional associations, tentatively categorized as focus. He did not say this. He felt that commenting on someone's iris pigmentation during a diplomatic incident was outside the range of professionally advisable behavior. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked a follow-up question about the specific pressure adjustment he had made in the third minute of intervention, which indicated she had either been briefed in considerable detail or had a working knowledge of emergency medicine that she had not mentioned. And Kale answered it, and she asked another, and they were 3 exchanges into what had become, without either of them formally deciding so, an actual clinical conversation when one of the Velosian officials near the door made a small sound that carried the energy of an institution politely clearing its throat. Sarevith did not look at him. She asked her next question. Kale, who had spent the last several hours being managed by people with agendas, felt something in his shoulders relax slightly, which he recognized as the specific physical response to being treated like a professional rather than a problem. He answered the question. He answered the one after that. At some point, because the alternative was to continue existing in a state of unrelieved professional gravity that his nervous system was increasingly reluctant to sustain. He mentioned that VERA had rated the overall situation a 7.3 on her institutional disruption index and had recommended stress leave, and that he found this simultaneously reasonable and deeply unhelpful given that he currently had 8 patients in a queue he was not permitted to access. Then VERA's voice came through the bay speaker to inform him that his administrative hold had been extended by another 6 hours, that the second unregistered vessel at the outer perimeter had now been joined by a third, and that the cafeteria was serving something described on today's menu as a nutrient-optimized comfort option, which in Kale's experience meant the kitchen was also having a difficult afternoon. The administrative leave lasted 4 days, which Kale spent in a state of enforced professional idleness that he found deeply, personally offensive. He was not good at stillness. He had never been good at stillness. Emergency medicine selects against it. The specialty is built on the premise that the correct response to any situation is immediate, calibrated action. And 6 years of practicing that premise had rewired whatever capacity for patient waiting he might once have possessed into something vestigial and increasingly restless. He read. He filed the reports he had been putting off for 2 months. He had a lengthy and one-sided argument with VERA through the room's console terminal about whether a 7.3 on the institutional disruption index warranted the specific phrasing she had chosen, and VERA responded to each of his points with updated probability assessments that addressed none of them. He visited the vending machine in Bay 7, which a maintenance team had finally repaired, and which now dispensed exactly what it claimed to dispense, and which he found, without the element of surprise, considerably less interesting. The diplomatic machinery continued operating without him, which was its nature and its purpose. He received briefings of formal, dense documents that arrived through the hospital's secure communication system and required the translation matrix at his terminal to render into something a human emergency physician could navigate without a law degree. He learned, through these documents, that the 3 unregistered vessels at the outer perimeter had been identified as belonging to a Velosian intelligence branch, whose existence the Protectorate officially neither confirmed nor denied, and that 2 of them had departed once the princess's security situation was assessed as stable. He learned that the 17 procedural violations attributed to his treatment had been reviewed by a joint medical diplomatic committee and reclassified. Through a process the documents described with considerable bureaucratic elegance as falling outside standard jurisdictional parameters given the operational conditions in which they occurred, which Kale understood to mean that enough important people had decided his being right was more useful than his being wrong. He learned the princess's name from a file that arrived on the 3rd day. Velith. He read it, said it quietly once to confirm the pronunciation his translation chip offered, and then sat with the strange, specific feeling of learning the name of someone whose life had passed through his hands without introduction. It was not a feeling emergency medicine prepared you for, exactly. You saved people without knowing them and moved to the next emergency, and the work carried you forward before the weight of any individual moment could accumulate. Knowing her name after the fact reversed that sequence in a way he had no established protocol for managing. The formal request arrived on the morning of the fourth day, in 17 parts, which he was beginning to understand was simply how the Velosian government communicated everything, as though brevity were a diplomatic liability. He read it once and understood approximately a third of it. He read it again with the translation matrix running contextual analysis on the institutional terminology and understood somewhat more. He made coffee, which the room's fabricator produced with competent indifference, and he read it a third time. The Velosian Protectorate was requesting, through the appropriate interspecies diplomatic channels and with the full procedural weight of a formal governmental communication, that Dr. Kale Morrow be considered for appointment as the princess's primary attending physician for the duration of her recovery, and contingent on mutual agreement, for an ongoing medical consultancy role with the royal household. Not a Velosian specialist, not a multi-species team assembled from the most credentialed practitioners in 3 systems, which would have been the logical and procedurally correct approach, and which he had assumed was already being arranged. Him specifically, the human emergency generalist, who had improvised his way through 10 minutes of cross-species trauma medicine with academic preparation and professional instinct, who had treated her like every other patient because he had not known she was anything other than every other patient, who had not asked her name or checked her identity or activated a single royal protocol, because he had been too busy trying to keep her alive to do any of those things. He read the request a 4th time to be certain it still said what it said. It did. He was still sitting with this information, in the particular way you sit with information that has not yet finished changing the shape of what comes next, when his door signal indicated a visitor. He accepted it without checking who it was, because 4 days of administrative leave had reduced his threshold for company to approximately 0, and Sarevith Olin Vey walked into his room with the same quality of presence she had carried into the diplomatic reception room, the kind that reorganized the available space without making any visible effort to do so. She did not sit. She looked at him with the second iris ring in its focused copper register, and she asked him, directly and without the scaffolding of diplomatic preamble, whether he had read the communication. He said he had read it 4 times. She said that was fewer times than she had expected. He told her he was a fast reader, and that he had also spent some time staring at the wall between readings, which probably brought the total cognitive engagement to a comparable level. The iris ring moved in a direction he was beginning, cautiously, to associate with something approaching amusement. He noted this internally and kept his expression professionally neutral, which was a skill emergency medicine also selected for. She told him then something that was not in the formal communication. She told him that Velith had been asking questions about human medicine, about how decisions were made without complete information, about the specific logic of treating available evidence rather than waiting for certainty. She told him that the princess had asked these questions with the particular focused persistence of a child who had encountered something she wanted to understand, and that the household physicians had answered them as best they could, but that the answers were second-hand in a way Velith had apparently found insufficient. Kale thought about a child with 4 fingers slightly curled on a white sheet, a luminescent mark at the base of her throat pulsing steady and even, and the fact that he had not looked at her face for longer than was clinically necessary because he had 13 patients in his queue and the work carried you forward. He asked Sarevith what would happen to the 17 procedural violations if he accepted the appointment. She told him they had been reclassified. He asked what that meant in practical terms. She said it meant they were no longer violations. He considered this for a moment. He asked if VERA would be part of the arrangement, because he felt that any medical framework built around his professional judgment ought to include some mechanism for rating the institutional disruption it caused, and he had grown accustomed to hers specifically. Saravath Olenve looked at him with the expression she had produced once before, the one that arrived against intention, the precise movement in the direction of a smile rather than the thing itself. She said that VERA's inclusion had not been part of the original communication, but that she would raise it through the appropriate channels, which would take some time given the number of parts those channels tended to generate. He said 17, probably. She said at minimum. He looked out the window at the docking ring where the remaining Velosian vessel sat moored, its hull running lights pulsing in the slow pattern he had been told was an expression of gratitude. He had been watching those lights for 4 days, without fully deciding what to do about what they meant. Outside the window, the station's external sensors registered a freighter on its approach vector to Ring 2, and beyond that the particular dense darkness of deep space, which did not care about diplomatic incidents or procedural reclassifications, or the decisions made in 10 minutes that turned out to matter for considerably longer. He thought about the endless queue. The next patient, always the next patient, the work carrying you forward before you could stop to understand what the last thing had meant. He thought about how he had not asked her name, and how she had asked for his, and the strange asymmetry of that exchange. That care, given without recognition, had still been received as care. He turned back from the window. He told Saravath Olenve that he would need his patient queue cleared through the end of the week, that any cross-species medical consultancy would require him to maintain access to VERA's database regardless of jurisdictional complications, and that if the Velosian Protectorate's communication infrastructure was going to be his primary administrative channel going forward, someone on their end was going to have to commit to fewer than 17 parts per document, or he was going to need a dedicated translation officer, because he was a doctor and not a diplomat, and he intended to remain one. Saravath considered this with the stillness of her species and her training. Then she said that his terms were noted and would be transmitted. He asked how many parts the transmission would have. She said she would endeavor to keep it under 12. He said that was almost reasonable. She left the way she arrived, without ceremony, with presence. The door closed, and Cale stood in the quiet of his room for a moment, alone with the sounds of the station and the distant pulse of running lights through the window, and he felt, underneath the exhaustion and the paperwork, and the 4 days of enforced stillness, something he recognized from the best moments of emergency medicine, the particular clarity that arrives when a crisis has moved through its worst point, and what remains, still uncertain and still unfinished, is at least pointing somewhere forward. He picked up his terminal, he opened a new patient file, he started reading.